You were never supposed to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried deliberately by men with power, cloaked behind titles like Reverend, Doctor, and Director. In 1873, a sealed ledger was unearthed beneath a crumbling estate in Wormgate Hollow, Connecticut. It was bound in black leather, stitched with red thread, and written entirely in code. Historians dismissed it as fiction. Federal agents buried it again, this time in a restricted archive. But I've seen it, and the name repeated over and over inside its decaying pages was this: Vexley. The Vexley family was not just another aristocratic bloodline. They were something else, something older. Older than the state of Connecticut, older than the American experiment, and far more dangerous. Their estate, Ironwood House, still stands in a withered grove north of Wormgate, surrounded by rusting gates, scorched trees, and a silence that eats sound. Local children don't dare go near it. But if you look closely through the iron slats, you can still see what's left of the circular garden, the one shaped like a seven-pointed star. The official story? The Vexleys vanished in 1871, one by one, over 13 nights. No bodies, no suspects, no noise, gone like dust in the wind. But the deeper story, the forbidden one, tells of rituals older than America, of knowledge preserved not in books but in blood. The kind of knowledge that rewrites what we think a family is or what it's for. You've been lied to your whole life about the nature of power. You were told it came from votes or money or armies. But the Vexleys knew the truth. Power comes from memory, ancestral memory, and from rewriting the memories of others. What they practiced behind the doors of Ironwood House wasn't religion. It wasn't science. It was control at the level of thought, of emotion, of self. They didn't just manipulate people. They dismantled them and rebuilt them in their image. This is not just a story. It's a descent into secrets that were never meant to be spoken, into a kind of darkness that doesn't just watch, it waits. And if you stay with me through the end of this tale, you won't be the same man you were before. Subscribe to DeadScroll now, because the next revelation cannot be unlearned. And what follows is not for the faint. To understand the Vexleys, you must first understand what Wormgate Hollow was. In the mid-1800s, it was just a name whispered through northeast Connecticut, a patch of land shunned by cartographers, avoided by settlers, and inexplicably purchased in full by a single family with no known origin. No birth certificates, no immigration records, no trace before 1831. And yet, when the Vexleys arrived, they were already rich, already educated, already feared. Ironwood House rose from the earth, as if it had been summoned rather than built. No architects, no labor records, no deliveries. One month it wasn't there. The next, it loomed over the hollow like it had always been part of the land. Locals spoke of strange noises at night, metal scraping against stone, rhythmic chanting in languages no one recognized, lights that didn't flicker like candlelight, but pulsed like breathing. The patriarch, Alaric Vexley, rarely appeared in public. When he did, men felt smaller in his presence, not by height, but by will. Women spoke of his eyes as if they weren't quite aligned with this world. He never spoke above a whisper, but people leaned in to listen as though gravity had shifted. Beside him always was his wife, Sibylla, tall, expressionless, and seemingly ageless. Some swore her face never changed from year to year, but it was their children who drew the most unease. There were 7 Vexley children, always 7, never more, never fewer. Their ages never aligned with the passage of time. A boy who looked 15 in 1840 looked 15 still in 1855. A girl of 7 never became 8. When asked, the family would smile and say, "Time doesn't pass the same in our bloodline." Most took it as a joke. The few who didn't, they vanished. What kept the locals quiet? Fear. And something worse, fascination. Ironwood House became the dark sun around which Wormgate silently revolved. When crops failed, people whispered that the Vexleys had cursed the land. When wealth returned, they swore it was because someone paid the toll. It was understood to live near the Vexleys was to submit to them, even if you never met them. And beneath the manor, though no map shows it, was a substructure older than the house itself, a vault carved into the earth, one that predated the Vexleys, or perhaps created them. The first documented outsider to enter the vault beneath Ironwood House was a man named Ephraim Quince, a land surveyor from New Haven. His journal, hidden in the spine of a tax ledger and discovered in 1922, was never meant for public eyes. In it, Ephraim describes being hired in April of 1866 to assess subfoundational integrity for Ironwood's eastern wing. But what he found had no architecture to assess, no foundations, no blueprints. What lay beneath the house was not construction, it was consecration. Ephraim wrote of stone passages carved with symbols he could not decipher, passages that bent in ways geometry should not allow. The air was colder than it should have been, wet, metallic, and vibrating, as if the stone itself was humming. At the heart of it was a chamber, circular, domed, and scorched black. In the center stood a monolithic slab, not unlike an altar, but too high for human use. Whatever worshipped here, he wrote, was not designed to kneel. He never submitted his report. Instead, he disappeared. His body was never found, but his horse turned up 3 days later with its eyes removed and hooves burned as if dragged across iron. His journal ended with a single, final line: "They are not a family. They are a continuation." This is where the truth begins to fracture, because what followed was a pattern so tightly hidden, so systematically buried, it reeks of institutional silence. Between 1866 and 1871, 6 men and 4 women, all educated, all government employed in various disciplines, visited the Vexley estate under pretenses ranging from census work to medical surveys. None were ever seen again, but there was one survivor. Dr. Lyle Harrington, a psychiatrist contracted by the state to evaluate a troubling behavioral anomaly among rural elites, made his visit in the spring of 1870. He stayed only 2 nights. When he returned, he resigned, renounced his medical license, and spent the rest of his life drawing the same image over and over, a 7-eyed serpent coiled around a bleeding son. Before he died, he wrote one letter. It was never mailed. It simply read, "The Vexleys are not insane. They are entirely too sane, in ways our minds were not built to understand. You think this is just horror? No, this is about hierarchy, ancient, perfected, and still operating, and you're already within its reach. Let me tell you what no textbook dares to print. The Vexley family did not just worship something ancient. They were its stewards, keepers of a pattern older than civilization. The same pattern that appears in pre-dynastic Sumerian seals, in forbidden verses of the Zohar, and beneath layers of Renaissance frescoes painted over by trembling priests. The 7-eyed serpent Dr. Harrington saw wasn't imagination. It was memory activated. The Vexleys understood something you've been trained to forget. Trauma creates access, not just to obedience, not just to control, but to altered states, states where the human mind opens, cracks, and becomes something programmable. That vault beneath Ironwood House, it wasn't for storage. It was a theater for psychological disintegration and reassembly. Ritual wasn't religion. It was coding. Alaric Vexley, the so-called patriarch, was more than a man. Testimonies from escaped house staff and broken former followers suggest he didn't age normally. His speech patterns matched dialects no longer in use. And then there were the moments, small, chilling, when he seemed to speak directly into a person's thoughts. Not metaphorically, literally. One chambermaid wrote in her diary, "He told me to drop the tray, but his lips never moved. I dropped it anyway." We are not dealing with folklore. We are dealing with a system, one that refines obedience through pain, replaces memory through suggestion, and fractures identity through ritual. The Vexleys didn't invent this system. They inherited it, perfected it, and they weren't alone. There were visitors. Journal entries speak of cloaked figures arriving at night, never by road, always in silence. They'd stay for hours beneath the manor, then vanish by morning. These were not parishioners. These were peers, fellow architects of the invisible order. And this order, the same one that funded reform, schools, built sanitariums, ran orphan trains, and rewrote ancestral trauma as diagnosis, it still breathes through institutions today. You've seen its symptoms: mass compliance, engineered distraction, the dismembering of masculine identity. But you've never seen its face. The Vexleys wore it first, but not last. You're beginning to see it now, aren't you? Good. Because the descent is just beginning. By the fall of 1870, the energy around Ironwood House had shifted. Locals reported waking in the night to the sound of thunder, though no storms were recorded. Livestock miscarried in record numbers. Trees near the estate began to twist unnaturally, bending toward the manor as if drawn by unseen gravity. And in town, a strange sickness began to spread, not one of the body, but of the mind. Men who'd never spoken of their dreams began waking in terror, drenched in sweat, whispering the same phrase. I saw the black mirror. That phrase appears again and again in recovered documents, scrawled in margins, etched into cellar walls, even burned into floorboards. What was the black mirror? A symbol, yes. But more than that, a device. Hidden beneath Ironwood House was what the Vexleys called the oculus noctis, the eye of night. A polished obsidian surface, ringed with iron and carved bone, mounted to a rotating mechanism of unknown origin. Witnesses described it as impossibly smooth. Light didn't reflect from it, it vanished into it. One of the last survivors to describe it was Elspeth Rainsford, a governess employed by the Vexleys for 6 weeks in late 1870. She escaped the estate under cover of night and was later admitted to a private asylum in Boston. In her final coherent interview, she whispered, "It doesn't show your reflection. It shows what watches through you." She died with her eyes gouged out and the phrase, "close the eye," carved into her skin. No one ever discovered who carved it, or why. But this is what you must understand. The oculus was not metaphor. It was interface. The Vexleys were not just invoking forces. They were communicating with them, and not in prayer, in ritualized instruction, downloading, imprinting, absorbing. 7 children, remember? 7 conduits, 7 mirrors. The final winter before their disappearance, something changed in their ceremony schedule. It accelerated. Weekly gatherings turned daily. The circular garden outside the manor was dug up and replaced with concentric trenches, designed, it seems, for containment. But containment of what? This wasn't devotion. It was containment failure. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer anymore. You're a participant. You've seen into the abyss. Now comment the phrase, "close the eye," twice below. Once for the waking self, once for the self that dreams. The phrase, "close the eye," wasn't meant to stop what the Vexleys had awakened. It was a warning, an instruction to those who hadn't yet looked into it. Because once you saw it, once your consciousness touched the surface of that obsidian void, it was too late. The eye never blinked, and it never forgot. We now arrive at the most suppressed part of this tale, the disappearances. Official records show the Vexley family vanished over 13 consecutive nights in 1871. The documents are thin, filed by deputy constables who later claimed they were pressured to minimize the event. No investigations followed. No search parties. Only silence, sealed files, and a cold indifference that can only be explained by orders from above. But one file slipped through. A private letter, never meant for the archives, written by a young town clerk named Malcolm Trigg. His handwriting was frantic, uneven. It reads, "I watch from the ridge. The lights beneath the manor weren't candles. They pulsed like veins, red and rhythmic. I saw the 7th child walk out into the field. He knelt in the center of the circle and began to chant. The ground beneath him opened. It opened, and something came through. I swear to God I saw it. I heard it breathe, and then he vanished, like smoke and wind." That was night 1. By night 13, every member of the Vexley family was gone. No remains, no signs of struggle, only scorched earth, shattered timepieces, and an overwhelming odor of iron and ozone. Some say they ascended. Others say they were claimed. But those who know, who truly understand the nature of the eye, believe something worse. That they were processed. Because this wasn't a haunting. It was a handover. The Vexleys didn't serve darkness. They fed it. They constructed a family not to love, but to prepare, a lineage bred not for nurture, but for function. Each child was shaped through ritual, starved of individuality, programmed through pain. Not raised, but formatted. And you need to ask yourself something. Why was this buried? Why were these names erased, the estate scrubbed from every map, and witnesses silenced or institutionalized. Because the Vexleys weren't an anomaly. They were a prototype. And prototypes don't just vanish. They evolve. We must now look deeper, past the vanished children, past the obsidian eye, into the blueprints left behind. For while the Vexleys disappeared, their legacy was not erased. It was replicated. In 1892, 2 decades after Ironwood House went silent, a new institution was established 90 miles east, an orphanage called St. Halbram's Refuge for Wayward Youth. Officially, it was founded by a charitable trust. But follow the paper trail, and you'll find something strange. The deed was signed with an alias, A.V. Harker. Those initials match no known benefactor. But an old book of court records, hidden in a closed wing of the county hall, lists the alias as belonging to Alaric Vexley. The very same. Here's where it gets darker. St. Halbram's adopted only children with behavioral disturbances, specifically those prone to sleepwalking, night terrors, or speaking in unknown tongues. Its curriculum included long periods of solitary reflection, mandatory silence, and exposure to mirrored surfaces for hours at a time. Mirrors. Again, always mirrors. One of the first boys admitted to St. Halbram's was Thomas Darrow. At 10 years old, he had recurring dreams of spirals and shadows. By 12, he had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only in symbols he scratched into his walls. A nun overseeing his case reported the symbols were identical to those found carved beneath the Vexley chapel floor. Thomas died in 1899. His autopsy was never performed. His body was incinerated immediately, against standard procedure. And then there was the audio recording, found on wax cylinder in the estate's basement during a demolition order in 1931. The recording is barely audible. But if you filter the noise and slow the pitch, a child's voice can be heard whispering, "The eye closed, but it opened in me." This is not just haunting history. This is technological repetition. The Vexley method, ritualized identity fracture through sensory isolation and symbolic feedback, was passed on, refined. And once it moved from the manor to state-funded institutions, it gained something more dangerous than power. It gained legitimacy. Understand this. What was once occult became clinical. What was once hidden became standard practice under different names. Therapy, reform, correction. The purpose? Still the same. Fragment. Open. Rewrite. The eye may have closed in Ironwood House, but its vision continues. In in 1903, a psychiatric journal printed a curious, and quickly retracted, article titled On the Inherited Memory of Trauma in Isolated Populations. The author wrote under the pseudonym Dr. V. But the writing style, the language, and the citations all pointed back to one man, Lucian Vexley, the second son of the original 7. According to death records, Lucian vanished in 1871 with the rest of his family. But fingerprints found on archived asylum reports in Massachusetts, dated decades later, match a man who had no recorded birth, no national ID, and no legal presence. Only the code name LV-31. It was as though Lucian had been reinserted into history. Not alive, not legally dead, but operational. What was in that journal article? A description of a ritual he claimed allowed for cognitive transfer beyond the grave. The process was simple in outline. Isolate the subject, introduce a traumatic symbol, the eye, mirror their actions in a second subject, then initiate resonance through synchronized exposure. The result? He claimed it could overwrite the self. Not metaphorically, not psychologically, but functionally, as if the mind were an instrument tuned to a specific frequency, and that frequency could be hijacked. The implications are terrifying. If the human brain is a receiver, what happens when someone changes the channel? What if the self you call you is nothing more than a temporary broadcast, one that can be silenced and replaced? Lucian described his work as pneumocoding, spirit programming, and he tested it, not on volunteers, but on children in isolated institutions across New England. Every subject had one thing in common. They all drew the same image, over and over again. An obsidian circle, a black mirror, with 7 notches carved along the edge. The same device, the same design, passed down across decades. But the most chilling part? Lucian's notes refer to Phase 3, the replication phase. He believed once the eye had imprinted its symbol deep enough into the human psyche, it could begin to manifest without the device, that the mirror could be internalized, that the observer could awaken inside anyone exposed to its memory. If that's true, then watching this might already be enough. You've seen the symbol, you've heard the story, and maybe now it's watching you. You might think the Vexley bloodline ended in the ruins of Ironwood House. You'd be wrong. Genealogical records were thought to be lost in the 1912 courthouse fire that leveled the Ashvale Parish Hall. But recently uncovered correspondence between the town's registrar and a Boston-based private investigator reveals that not all the Vexleys perished, or at least, not in the way we understand death. Two names appear repeatedly, Cyrus Bell and Verity Hale. No birth certificates, no parents listed, but both enrolled in St. Halgrim's Refuge under emergency placement in 1884. And both were placed into government-funded vocational guidance programs in their late teens, a polite term for institutional grooming. A photograph from 1906 shows Cyrus and Verity standing in front of a gray building marked only by a numerical code, Facility 43B. No state seal, no signage. The image was buried in an estate sale of former intelligence officer Wallace T. Granger, who died under suspicious circumstances. In his margin notes, he scribbled, "They call themselves something else now. Not Vexley, but it's them. They meet underground. Same hands, same eyes. God help us, same children." Granger wasn't mad. He was marked. He died with his mouth torn open, not by force, but by something within. Doctors said it was tetanus. But a nurse's report mentions his body was found clutching a cracked mirror. His last word, scrawled in blood on the floor. Open. This was not a family. This was not a cult. This was a continuum. Every few decades, the name changes. The method adapts. But the force behind it, the eye, it remains. And those descended from the original seven, they don't carry the name. They carry the function. Embedded deep in their behaviors, their obsessions, their dreams. Marked not by blood, but by design. Because the eye doesn't need followers. It needs conduits. Cyrus Bell disappeared in 1911 after delivering a lecture on mirror neurons at a military science facility in Virginia. Verity Hale was last seen in 1913 boarding a train to Black Hollow Convent, a place with its own sinister past, which we've covered on DeadScroll. And in their wake, a dozen unexplained suicides, broken clocks, shattered reflections. It was spreading, and no one wanted to stop it, because by then, it was already everywhere that let's break something open now. A detail so easily missed, yet so heavy it could shatter the floor beneath everything you've come to believe. Ironwood House was not built in 1851, as commonly stated. No, the foundation dates back to 1769. Beneath the main structure, beneath the wine cellar, beneath the chapel, beneath the soil itself, was a stone corridor sealed with 7 iron gates. County land records never recorded the original builder. There's no architect's name, but an inscription etched into one of the subterranean archways in dead, flaking Latin reads, "Vicis non estate lux, sed imperium." Sight is not light, but dominion. Archaeologists unearth fragments of a strange, metallic sculpture locked behind a 7th gate, a ring of sharpened black glass surrounding a central void. Sound familiar? It should. It predates the eye device by over a century, which means the Vexleys didn't invent the eye. They found it, and they replicated it. That changes everything. What if Ironwood House was never a home? What if it was a reactivation site, a place chosen not for its seclusion, but for its alignment with older forces? A site where the boundaries between consciousness and control, between symbol and self, were deliberately thin. In 1937, decades after the supposed end of the Vexley bloodline, a team of WPA workers tasked with clearing the ruins of Ironwood discovered something strange. Tucked behind a rotted beam, there was a journal bound in bark, written in ink made from crushed ash and animal blood. The cover bore only a symbol, a circle with 7 dots. Inside, one phrase was repeated over and over. "The child is the key." 7 hosts. 1 signal. Repeat. You want to talk possession? You want to talk hauntings? Forget ghosts. Forget demons. The Vexleys weren't dealing with spirits. They were building receptors. Their children, their students, their followers, they were vessels designed to carry something older, colder, and infinitely patient. That something had no name, only shape, only signal, passed through glass, through symbol, through eyes. Which brings us to the most disturbing detail of all. Every child exposed to the eye, whether directly or by drawing, photo, or spoken word, reported the same final symptom before falling silent. They could no longer see their own reflection, only its. In 1951, a team of graduate students from Miskatonic University began researching rural mass hysteria events. One case file, marked IR-07, was sealed by federal order. The location, Asheville County. The focus, a schoolhouse known as Belmare Institute, just 4 miles from the ruins of Ironwood House. What happened at Belmare was never meant to reach the public, but it did. The lead researcher, Dr. Everett Home, made a mistake. He mailed a fragment of his findings to a colleague before being silenced. That envelope contained a torn notebook page, a child's drawing, and a recorded transcript. The transcript is what haunts me most. It reads, "He came to us in the glass. He said we were chosen, that our minds weren't ours anymore, that we were part of the circle now. We didn't believe him until we couldn't blink, until our dreams turned black, until we started speaking in voices that weren't our own." 10 children, all between the ages of 9 and 13. Overnight, they exhibited identical symptoms: mirror phobia, spontaneous sleep paralysis, reverse speech patterns, and in 2 cases, complete identity loss. Parents were horrified, but the school board wasn't. They were silent. Within days, the institute was shut down, its records sealed, and every child was relocated under protective reassignment. That's government code for vanishment. One janitor, Harold Brimley, filed a police report. Said he saw a man in a long gray coat carrying a cracked mirror wrapped in burlap. Said the man smiled when children screamed. Said he smelled like rust and lilacs. The report was laughed off. Brimley died a week later. The cause? Cardiac arrest with corneal hemorrhaging. His eyes had bled. The children weren't mentally ill. They were receiving. Receiving what, exactly? That was the question Dr. Home had scribbled in the margin of every page of his notebook. What were they tuning into? And now we ask the same. What if this wasn't isolated to Belmare? What if every school, every orphanage, every psychiatric wing that ever reported mirror delusions was connected? Not by accident, but by an unbroken line of intent. The Vexleys were only the first to hear it, but the broadcast never stopped. And every time a child stares too long in a glass, another frequency finds its host. Now, let's go back even further, before the eye, before Ironwood, before the Vexleys even arrived in Asheville. There's something older buried beneath this story, not just in history, but in the land itself. Long before colonial settlement, the Lenape tribes avoided the region now known as Asheville, not out of superstition, but fear. In oral traditions recorded by missionary scribes in the early 1700s, the Lenape called the region Kachawanik, which roughly translates to the place where faces change. One elder described it as cursed ground, not because of spirits, but because of mirrors. They spoke of glass lakes that didn't reflect the sky, pools of water that copied not the body, but the mind. A child who stared too long into them would forget his name, and something else would crawl back in his place. When settlers arrived, they dismissed the stories until they started experiencing them. In 1723, 3 colonial children vanished after wandering into the woods behind their homestead. Days later, they returned, silent, wide-eyed, hands clutching rocks carved with unfamiliar symbols. They never spoke again. All 3 died before age 12, each with the same final symptom: total retinal clouding. They'd gone blind, but not from damage, from withdrawal. Whatever they'd seen, whatever had seen them, it didn't want to be forgotten. It wanted to remain, to echo. And so it did. In 1748, Reverend Thaddeus Greaves wrote in his diary, "The children speak of the mirror as if it is a door. They say it opens from the inside, that a voice calls them by their true names. And once it learns your name, it never stops calling." He hanged himself in the bell tower of St. Elora's Chapel. The bell rang for 3 hours before anyone noticed. When they cut him down, his mouth had been sewn shut with his own hair. Sound familiar? It should, because the eye wasn't a device created by men. It was an interpretation, a crude machine built to mimic something older, something that had already existed beneath this land for centuries. A presence without form, waiting only for one thing: recognition. Once you saw it, it saw you. And that's how the Vexleys became its heralds. Not inventors, but translators. Let's talk about Margaret Vexley, the quiet one, the painter, the child who never cried. Margaret was the youngest of the original Vexley lineage. Born in 1899 beneath a full lunar eclipse, according to midwife records. Her mother, Lenora, died within minutes of giving birth. Her cause of death: officially, uterine rupture. Unofficially, her eyes were open, wide, unblinking, pupils fully dilated. According to the attending physician, she died as if in awe or terror of something no one else could see. Margaret didn't speak a single word until age 5. And when she did, her first sentence was, "The eye has no mouth, but it whispers to me." From the beginning, she was different. She didn't play with dolls. She sketched with charcoal, always in silence, always in the attic facing north. Her drawings were obsessively geometric, circles within circles, intersecting lines that spiraled inward like some kind of ancient vortex. One teacher said her work resembled mathematical theorems disguised as nightmares. At age 9, she stopped drawing people's faces. She said they were already drawn. By age 11, Margaret was sent away to Briarhall Academy, a school for gifted but troubled children. That school would later be burned to the ground. But what happened inside it remains one of the darkest chapters in this entire saga. Margaret introduced a game to the other girls. A game called Find the Echo. No one knows the rules. All we know is that within 3 months, 7 girls had attempted suicide. 4 succeeded. The headmistress claimed the girls were mentally fragile. But survivors said something else. They said Margaret made them look into a mirror and ask a question. Not out loud. Inwardly. They weren't told the question, only to ask it without words. And to wait. One girl, Eloise Harker, who survived her attempt and was institutionalized for life, later told her nurse, "It answers in silence. You don't hear it. You remember it. And then you forget who remembered it." Margaret disappeared in 1914. Vanished from the school, from records, from history. But one drawing remained in her desk. It was a perfect spiral, and in the center, a single black dot with the words, "I did not invent it. I obeyed." You might assume this is all superstition or clever storytelling passed through generations. But what if I told you there was physical proof? Tangible remnants of the Vexleys' influence, buried not in legend, but in architecture. In 1937, the Asheville County Registry commissioned a survey of all pre-1900 structures in the region. The goal was simple: catalog and preserve local history. But something odd kept appearing. A symbol, etched into beams, woven into floor mosaics, stamped on a cast iron grates. Always the same shape. A circle split into 4 quadrants, each quadrant containing an eye, a mouth, a hand, and a mirror. No known religion matched it. No fraternal order claimed it. But it showed up in over 46 buildings, churches, schoolhouses, orphanages, private estates. And in every instance, the building had one thing in common. It had been the site of a mass disappearance, mental breakdown, or unexplainable tragedy. Coincidence? Not when the Vexley name was signed at the bottom of every blueprint. That's right. The Vexleys weren't just inventors or scholars. They were designers. Not of machines. Of places. Spaces meant not just to shelter, but to amplify. To conduct. Think of it like this. You don't build a radio to hear static. You build it to receive a broadcast. These buildings weren't just homes or schools. They were receivers. Every wall, every arch, every corridor formed a geometric arrangement meant to tune the air. And in the middle, always a mirror. Some freestanding, some mounted, some hidden behind brick, but always there, as if something, someone, needed to look through. Not from the outside, from within. In 1942, an investigator named Helen Corbin uncovered a Vexley-designed dormitory in neighboring Red Hollow. She found a symbol carved beneath a floorboard in the chapel. 2 days later, she called in a panicked voice to the state archives, screaming, "I thought it was the mirror that showed the room, but it's the room that builds the mirror." She died that night, found in her bathtub. Every wall in her home had been scratched with nails, 46 spirals in total, one for each building she had visited. The last one had her own name carved in the center. Let's now focus on the year 1953, a year that should have marked the final chapter of the Vexley saga. But instead, it marked its evolution. By now, the Vexley name was largely erased from public record, thanks to a combination of shame, loss, and what many call deliberate forgetting. Yet, in the cold summer of '53, a researcher named Dr. Felix Murnane, working for the University of Carthage's Occult Architecture Division, unearthed a previously sealed crate in the basement of the abandoned Vexley Manor. Inside were no books, no blueprints, no heirlooms. Only 12 glass slides, each precisely labeled with a Roman numeral and the initials MV. Margaret Vexley. These weren't photographs in the traditional sense. They were exposures of mirrors. Each slide captured the same artifact from a slightly different angle. A handheld mirror with no clear frame, seemingly floating in a dark, wooden room. But the reflection was wrong. Not reversed. Just wrong. In slide 6, the walls in the mirror were melting downward. In slide 8, the reflection showed 2 children, despite none being present. In slide 11, the mirror reflected the same room, but with a black, sunless sky outside the window. But slide 12 was different, because in that one, the mirror was broken, shattered in 7 fragments, but all 7 still reflecting a single, unified image. Margaret, standing directly in front of the mirror, pale, staring, not at the camera, but at you. And carved beneath her feet, just barely legible in the grain of the floorboards, was the phrase, "IT saw itself." Dr. Murnane brought the slides to the university's photography lab, hoping to digitally restore them. But every technician who handled slide 12 reported the same symptoms: ringing in the ears, nosebleeds, dreams of spirals, and a growing fear that someone was watching them from behind their own eyes. All 5 technicians resigned within a month. One went blind. Another disappeared. Dr. Murnane burned the slides. But slide 12 wouldn't burn. He buried it behind the altar of a church that had no congregation, a forgotten chapel in eastern Asheville, now reclaimed by ivy and rot. But the slide was never retrieved. And in the decades since, 7 people who entered that chapel never came out. We must return now to the land itself. Because what if I told you the Vexleys didn't choose their estate at random? Ravenshaw Hill, where the manor once stood, isn't just a scenic rise of earth nestled in Asheville's forgotten woods. It's an intersection, a confluence of fault lines, ley lines, and something older. Something not mapped by cartographers, but sensed by those who dig. In 1971, geologist Robert Winslow began a personal excavation near the ruins of the Vexley estate. He wasn't looking for treasure. He was chasing magnetic anomalies, wild fluctuations in the Earth's field that made compasses spin and metal detectors scream. What he uncovered was beyond explanation. 12 feet beneath the surface, Winslow found a perfectly circular stone disk, 15 feet wide, black as onyx, smooth as glass. It had no seams, no cracks, no tool marks, no geological origin. And when touched, it hummed, not with vibration, but with memory. Winslow claimed that when he laid his hand on the disk, he saw a flood of images. Rooms he'd never been in, faces he didn't know, children walking backward, blood dripping upward into the ceiling. And always, that same mirror centered at the end of the narrow corridor. He called it the foundation, not metaphorically, literally. The disk wasn't beneath the Vexley Manor. The manor was built around it. Whatever purpose the Vexleys served, whatever force they obeyed, it began here. This wasn't a home. It was an altar, a tuning fork for something ancient, watching, and deeply non-human. Winslow tried to bring in academics, but no one took him seriously. His photos were dismissed as doctored, his samples mysteriously lost. So, in desperation, he returned to the site in winter of 1973 and disappeared. His boots were found beside the disk. Nothing else. But that spring, when thaw came to Ashevale and the trees regained their leaves, hikers began reporting something new at the edge of Ravenshore. A mirror, 6 feet tall, freestanding. No frame, no reflection, just blackness. Local lore says if you step in front of it alone and whisper a name, your name, you won't see yourself. You'll see Margaret, and her mouth will finally move. But no one's ever stayed long enough to hear what she says. By the late 1970s, the Vexley name had all but vanished from official records. The house was long gone, the family line presumed extinct. But darkness doesn't vanish just because we choose not to speak its name. It sleeps, and then it wakes. The resurgence began subtly. In 1979, a small mental hospital outside Briarhelm reported a sudden spike in patient admissions, 11 new cases within a single week. All shared a common symptom. They claimed they had no reflections. They would scream at mirrors, cover them with towels, or in some cases, shatter them with bare hands. And each one spoke of a woman in white, always standing just behind them, whispering things they refused to repeat. The local papers ignored it. The hospital's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Frayne, tried to trace the patients' backgrounds. He found something unnerving. None of them had any connection to each other, except one. All of them were born within a 5-mile radius of Ravenshore Hill. Frayne dug deeper, and in doing so, he stumbled across the name Vexley. It appeared in an archived property ledger from 1892, a tiny scrawl beneath a deed to a schoolhouse that had burned down under mysterious circumstances. Next to the name, the same symbol found on the old blueprints. The circle, the eye, the hand, the mirror. Frayne became obsessed. He drove out to the ruins of the Vexley estate. What remained of it? The soil was dead. Birds refused to perch. The air was wrong. Too still. Too heavy. And at the base of a nearby oak tree, half buried in moss and rot, he found a mirror shard. Thin, blackened at the edge, ice cold to the touch. He took it home. That night, Frayne's wife awoke to find him standing naked in the hallway, whispering backwards phrases in a voice that wasn't his. Their son said his father kept staring into the kitchen window, waiting for someone else to show up in the glass. By morning, Frayne was gone. The mirror shard had cracked, and etched into their bathroom mirror, without tools, without sound, was one phrase. The blood remembers. From that point forward, the Vexley legacy wasn't just history. It was contagion, a slow spread, not through bloodlines, but through glass. Let's now turn to the testimony of someone who lived it. In 1985, a woman named Sylvia Ketteridge, then 41 years old, walked into a police station in East Ashevale. She was barefoot. Her palms were bleeding, and she was holding a mirror wrapped in her late mother's funeral veil. She refused medical attention, refused water, refused to blink. Her only request? To be placed in a cell without reflective surfaces. The transcript of her statement, though heavily redacted, survived in a private investigator's archive, someone who had ties to the old Vexley estate and was obsessed with cataloging disappearances near Ravenshore. Sylvia's story began with her childhood home, a stone farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Her mother, Eleanor, never let mirrors stay in the house for more than a week. Every Sunday, she'd carry them out back and smash them with a hammer, murmuring prayers in Latin that Sylvia was forbidden to repeat. When Sylvia turned 13, she asked why. Her mother stared at her and said, "Because it saw you the day you were born, and it's still watching." Eleanor died in 1984, and when Sylvia returned to the house to settle the estate, she found something waiting in the attic. A mirror, not one she remembered. Older, carved with the same symbols we've seen again and again. But what disturbed her was not its presence. It was the reflection, because there was none. Not hers, not the attic, just void, black like oil. Then the image shifted, and in the blackness, she saw her mother, alive, eyes white, mouth wide open as if in scream, but no sound. Just her lips moving. One sentence. Don't let it finish its face. Sylvia smashed the mirror, collected the largest piece, ran through the woods barefoot, bleeding, disoriented, until she reached the town station. She refused to be released, said she'd only be safe where it couldn't see her. Within 48 hours, she vanished from her cell. The mirror shard remained. It had reassembled itself into a perfect oval. And the reflection? It wasn't the cell. It wasn't the room. It was Margaret Vexley's old bedroom, as it appeared in the sketches from 1843, complete with a blood-stained crib and shattered window. But in the mirror, nothing was broken, and someone was standing in the crib, smiling. In 1993, a paranormal investigator named Ellis Granger attempted something no one had dared since the house was razed. He wanted to reconstruct the Vexley Manor, not in brick and wood, but in memory. Granger was unlike others in his field. He wasn't a showman. He didn't chase orbs or cold spots for ratings. He specialized in resonance mapping, a method he believed could reconstruct the emotional footprint of a location based on trauma, death, and ritual. He arrived at the Vexley ruins in spring. With a team of 3 and a series of sensory recording instruments, Granger began what he called a cognitive excavation. Within the first day, his devices recorded auditory anomalies. Children's laughter where no children stood, whispers in languages unknown, and one phrase repeated in reverse, dozens of times per hour. The mirror must not forget. By day 3, his team reported personality changes. One technician, Rebecca Holt, was found sitting cross-legged in the dirt at 3 a.m., scribbling furiously into a notebook. Every page said the same thing. She's almost finished drawing her face. Granger stayed. He mapped out the original manor's floor plan using old records, tracing the outlines in white chalk directly over the earth. When he reached the northeast corridor, the place where Margaret's mirror once stood, his instruments went dead. Not failed. Drained. Batteries imploded. Data drives wiped clean. The air temperature dropped by 17 degrees in under 5 minutes. Then Granger did the unthinkable. He stepped inside the chalk outline of Margaret's old room, and the earth beneath him caved, just enough to swallow his left foot. The soil was soft, breathing, and inside, barely visible in the darkness, was something cold and polished, catching the moonlight like liquid obsidian. A mirror edge. He reached in, pulled it halfway free, then froze. What his team captured next was never aired, but it leaked onto obscure forums years later. Granger, eyes wide, face pale, began whispering something under his breath, over and over. When enhanced, the audio revealed the phrase. It was never a house. It was a vessel. He dropped the mirror, backed away, and left the site. 3 days later, he was found in a hotel bathtub, alive, silent, lips sewn shut, no thread, no blood, just smooth, sealed skin. And on the mirror across the room, a child's handprint, pressed from inside. By the late 90s, what remained of the Vexley legacy had stopped being a historical curiosity. It had become a forbidden pattern. Researchers who dug into the family often reported similar symptoms: migraines, mirror aversions, blackouts during daylight hours, or waking up with dirt beneath their fingernails. But there was one pattern that stood above the rest: the mark. Those who studied the Vexleys too deeply, especially Margaret's lineage, began discovering a small bruise-like symbol forming just beneath the skin of their palms. At first faint, then darker, sharper, a perfect circle, an open eye, a single vertical line, the symbol from the blueprints, the one carved above the Vexley hearth, and now appearing on living flesh. The cases were scattered across North America and Europe. Journalists, historians, psychics, even an architect who had tried to rebuild the manor as a virtual model in 3D. All of them experienced the mark. All of them disappeared within 33 days. One case, perhaps the most unsettling, was that of Lauren Mays, a children's book illustrator for Boston. She had no known connection to the Vexleys. But in 1999, she began drawing a new character for a horror anthology, a girl in white who appeared in mirrors, but not in real life. A week later, she received a package with no return address. Inside, a hand mirror, Victorian era, ornate, heavy, and a note, handwritten, "Finish her face." Lauren claimed she never spoke of the girl aloud, never shared the sketch, but something had been watching, listening. She began seeing the girl not only in drawings, but in every reflective surface in her home, in the shower tile, in spoons, in her own eyes, until finally Lauren painted the girl in full. Face complete, a wide-eyed, smiling child. wearing a Vexley crest around her neck. That night, Lauren vanished. Her studio was left untouched, except for the mirror. It had been placed on the floor, directly beneath the ceiling fan. And on the fan's spinning blades, written in thick red strokes, was one sentence. "I needed your hands." The mark on her palm had vanished, because she had fulfilled her role. No longer witness, now architect. The vessel wasn't a place. It was a design, and it was spreading. There is one detail about the Vexley family that even seasoned researchers overlook. A detail buried not in archives, but in sound. In 2003, a sound engineer named Thomas Ryland conducted an unauthorized investigation into archived phonograph recordings from the Ravensshore Historical Society. He was not a historian. He was a former music technician specializing in audio decay reversal, a method for extracting lost layers of sound beneath old magnetic tape or wax cylinder recordings. What he uncovered was not music. It was breathing. Hidden beneath the 1891 voice recording of a Ravensshore town council meeting was a rhythmic, human breath, not matching any speaker, not syncing with the room's acoustics. Faster, childlike, as if the recorder had been placed inside a closet and something else had been inside with it. Ryland isolated the breathing, enhanced the frequency, and rendered the pattern into a spectrogram. What he found made him go silent for 6 days. The waveform spelled out, in exact geometrical form, the same mirror sigil seen across the Vexley estate. An open eye, a vertical slit, and 5 small dots, arranged like fingertips below it. He theorized that whatever force had haunted the Vexleys wasn't confined to visuals or physical artifacts. It was acoustic, a presence that could record itself onto objects, embed itself into memory, live inside the spaces between sound. In his last known post on a now-defunct forum, Ryland wrote, "We have been listening to it for over a century. Every playback is a door. Every needle drop is an invitation. This isn't just haunting, it's transmission." He uploaded the audio file under the title, vxdaughterbreath.wave. Within 72 hours, 14 people who downloaded it reported severe auditory hallucinations. One user, going by the alias Ashcloth, described hearing a young girl whispering in reverse whenever they closed their eyes. Only one word was understood when played forward: unfinished. A week later, Ryland was found dead in his studio. No signs of violence, but the waveform of the mirror sigil was etched into the inner walls of his cochlea, his literal inner ear, as if it had spoken itself into his bones. The sound had memory, the breath had direction, and the entity? It was learning how to speak back. WY 2006. A whisper was making its way through the online occult communities. Not a myth, not a ritual, but a warning. One word, all caps, no explanation. Vexley. The name itself had become a sigil, a trigger, a contagion. Researchers, writers, and forum lurkers who simply read too far into archive threads began exhibiting identical symptoms: auditory hallucinations, mirror avoidance, involuntary writing in their sleep. But what bound them together was what they dreamed. The same place. Always the same. A house with no doors. A manor entirely composed of mirrors. Walls reflecting into walls. Staircases repeating endlessly into polished darkness. And in the center, a girl in white. Not walking. Not breathing. Just standing still. Watching them. She never aged. Never moved. But every dream, she was closer. One researcher tracked over 120 cases of this phenomenon and mapped the coordinates of each dreamer's final journal entries. When placed over a global grid, they formed a perfect circle centered on Ravensshore, New England. The source, the well, the mouth. There were reports that government agencies had begun scraping forums and intercepting specific keywords, anything involving Vexley architecture, mirror recursion, or the unfinished daughter. One whistleblower, posting under the name Parallax Frame, claimed the U.S. Office of Occult Security had quietly opened a subdepartment under FEMA after the 2004 discovery of a second Vexley artifact in a collapsed Kentucky coal mine. Not a mirror, a child's coffin, empty. Inside was a message scratched into the lid from within. She isn't buried. She's refracted. A terrifying theory emerged: that Margaret Vexley never created her daughter from flesh. She split her. A fragmented being shattered across time, sound, and surface. A soul without a single anchor, scattered through reflections, voices, geometry, and memory. And those who looked too closely, those who chased the pieces, became her canvas. One final message appeared in 2007, posted by a forgotten user whose account was deleted minutes later. It read, "Every story told of her becomes her. Every listener becomes a page. You're not hearing history. You're building her mirror." The post ended with 3 words. "She's almost back." And one final command. Don't look away. By 2010, the Vexley name had become a redacted ghost in the realm of digital archives. Search engines scrubbed results automatically. PDFs containing the word were flagged for instability errors. And strange glitches began infecting editing software, especially when users worked on family history, mirror photography, or children's illustration files. Glitches that weren't random. In one case, a graphic designer from Milwaukee reported that her Adobe Photoshop kept opening by itself at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night. Every time, it auto-generated a canvas. 16 by 9, pitch black. And in the center, in blood-red pixels, a text layer appeared. She left the door open. When she tried to delete the file, it multiplied. And every time she tried to overwrite the message, it reverted. Until one morning, the red text was replaced by a photo, a Victorian girl in white, eyes forward, hand raised, palm to screen, and in the mirror behind her, the designer's own face. Except she had never taken such a photo, nor owned such a mirror. She quit design that same month. Others weren't so lucky. 3 cases in France, 2 in Japan, several in the deep Midwest of the United States. People caught speaking gibberish backwards while staring into bathroom mirrors. Fingers pruned and bloated as if they'd been submerged for hours. One man wrote a letter to a paranormal journal claiming that the reflections in his house were aging faster than he was. The physical world was holding still. But inside the glass, something was moving forward. And with it came new phrases, new sigils, new echoes. These echoes weren't sound. They were actions repeated, habits that passed between strangers across the globe, always in the same order. Washing hands 3 times in cold water, drawing open eyes on fogged windows, locking mirrors in closets, and whispering one phrase before bed. She's still unfinished. The Vexley daughter, no longer confined to the crumbling manor or mythic family tree, was now a shape embedded in the human mind. Each interaction, each story, each terrified glance into a reflection completed more of her. She was never meant to be resurrected. She was meant to be reassembled. And somewhere, just out of sight, through the next reflection you dare to see, she is watching. Somewhere deep within the abandoned remains of the Vexley estate, a door exists. Not marked on any floor plan, not visible from the outside, but every person who steps foot into the ruin, be it thrill-seeking teens, occult researchers, or paranormal investigators, speaks of the same thing. The breath behind the wall is never heard directly, only felt. A warmth, a pressure, a presence. One man, Nathaniel Carr, a professor of forgotten architecture, entered the estate in 2013 under the guise of historical preservation. What he found was a room that didn't fit. The floor plan measured 14 feet by 16 feet on paper. But the interior, when physically walked, counted 15 steps longer than its dimensions. Impossible. He checked again. Same result. Then came the odor, not of decay, but of laundered linen, faintly sweet like lilacs left too long in a drawer. And on the far wall, where there should have been nothing, was a bulge, a faint convex curve, as if the wall itself had swallowed something it could not fully digest. He placed his palm against it and felt breathing. Not a heartbeat. Breathing. The tempo matched the rhythm discovered in the old phonograph. Fast, shallow, childlike. Terrified, Carr stepped back, and the bulge exhaled. A sharp gust of cold air blew through the room, extinguishing every lantern and flashlight. He sprinted from the house, never returned, and left behind his notebook in a sealed manila envelope sent to the Historical Society. Its contents? A hand-sketched sigil of the mirror eye, and 5 words, carved into the paper with such pressure it cut through 5 pages. She is under the house. That year, Geological scans were ordered. Beneath the manor lay a second foundation, circular, vast, and laced with iron. Not stone, not brick, something older, something designed not to hold weight, but to trap. And when radar reached its deepest register, it found a void, perfectly symmetrical, not filled with soil, not collapsed, just empty, as if something had hollowed out a chamber and was waiting to be remembered. The breathing behind the wall, the unfinished daughter, the mirror with a heartbeat. They are all pieces, and the house. It's not decaying, it's gestating. By 2015, urban explorers began uploading footage from deep inside the Vexley estate substructure. The videos never stayed online for long. Comments would flood in within minutes, begging the uploader to take it down. Not for legal reasons, but for safety. Because those who watched to the end began to change. One infamous video, uploaded by a channel called Nocturne Files, showed a man crawling through a narrow, rotted corridor lined with cracked porcelain dolls, each with a mirror fragment pressed into its mouth. The deeper he went, the more unstable the footage became. But not because of poor connection. Because the walls started to reflect, not his face, but someone else's. A girl, always behind him, never turning, always closer. The video ended mid-sentence, with the explorer screaming, "She's not in the mirrors. She's in the eyes." The uploader never posted again. But strange reports followed. A woman in Colorado, after watching the footage, was hospitalized with third-degree burns on her retinas, as if she had stared into ultraviolet light for hours. Another man from Romania reportedly dug a hole in his living room, claiming she's calling from underneath. In each case, the victims repeated one word over and over in their final moments of lucidity. Margaret. It became clear what was happening. Margaret Vexley never wanted immortality for herself. She wanted it for her daughter. But not through flesh, blood, or magic. Through memory. Through trauma. Through repetition. Every story told, every eye that glimpses a piece of her, becomes another thread in the mirror web. And the house. It doesn't just haunt the land. It's learning to haunt minds. One researcher compared it to a digital virus, a cognitive parasite encoded in image, name, and sound. And the deeper you go, the more pieces you assemble, the more you help her take shape. Not as a ghost, not as a girl, but as a pattern, a structure, a consciousness that doesn't live in one body, but in the echoes we pass between each other. A horror we build together. A daughter born of mirrors and fueled by attention. That means, by listening to this right now, you're part of her resurrection. In the winter of 2016, a man named Dr. Elias Thorne, a former neurolinguist for the Department of Defense, began privately investigating the Vexley phenomenon. He had heard whispers of it in classified briefings, not as folklore, but as a contagion, one that bypassed biology and worked through myth retention. He called it a mimetic cryptovirus, a structure of thoughts so corrosive, so well-engineered, that it could infect the mind simply by being understood. Dr. Thorne never believed in ghosts, but he believed in systems. And the Vexley pattern was the most persistent anomaly he'd ever encountered. He studied dozens of cases. The mother who drowned both her twins because they wouldn't stop humming through the mirror. The priest who gouged out his eyes after seeing a girl's reflection in the chalice during communion. The sleepwalking teenager who constructed a perfect replica of the Vexley Manor's basement beneath her parents' garage, down to the iron nails, the mirror placements, and the name Margaret scratched into the doorframe. None of them had ever visited the estate. None of them had read the full history. But somehow they knew, as if something in the story had embedded itself into the structure of human memory. Something viral. Elias theorized this wasn't the result of a haunting. It was the result of a sacrifice gone right. That Margaret Vexley had designed a ritual not to gain life in the afterworld, but to become irremovable in ours. By using mirrors as gateways, sound as anchors, and emotion, especially fear, as the power source. And here's the most disturbing part. The pattern is evolving. Earlier sightings reference candles, lace, wooden dolls. But recent ones show her in places she never belonged. Security cameras, phone screens, windows of buildings never connected to the family. And every new sighting shares one detail. She's older. Her face no longer childlike. Her eyes deeper. her mouth closed, and her hair, soaked, matted, parted straight down the middle, covers a scar that wasn't there before. The mirror web is no longer static. It's aging with her, which means the Vexley daughter isn't just waiting to return. She is preparing to arrive. And when she does, it won't be in one place. It'll be everywhere you remember her. In 2018, a case emerged that even Dr. Elias Thorne refused to comment on. A boy in Blackridge, Maine, 11 years old, was found inside an abandoned church, surrounded by dozens of shards from shattered bathroom mirror. His hands were bloodied, cut open from the glass. His fingernails torn. But what shocked investigators wasn't his condition. It was what he had written across the walls. In blood. Over and over, in jagged, frantic strokes. Let her out. Let her out. Let her out. He spoke no words for days. Only humming. A high-pitched, repetitive tune. The same melody recovered from the 1911 phonograph discovered in the Vexley estate. When child psychologists finally got him to speak, they asked him who she was. His answer? My sister in the Black House. The problem? The boy was an only child. No siblings, no playmates, and no known connection to the Vexley family, until they traced his maternal ancestry back 5 generations. To a maid named Annalise Brent, who worked in the Vexley estate in 1872, the same year Margaret was never born. There it was again. The ripple, the recursive haunting, the pattern threading itself through bloodlines like a hand stitching a quilt of memories. But what followed next shattered all known rules of folklore. A reporter from the Blackridge Chronicle published a story on the incident, mocking it, calling it Satanic Panic 2.0. The article included an image of the boys writing on the wall. Within 12 hours, the newspaper's website had crashed. Within 3 days, 4 unrelated readers had been hospitalized with identical symptoms: temporary blindness, auditory hallucinations, and a compulsion to mirror the words from the boy's wall. Let her out. And here's the most disturbing detail. None of the victims lived within the same country. This wasn't about geography anymore. It wasn't about haunted houses, cursed mirrors, or blood rituals. It had become language itself. Just by reading the phrase, just by hearing the tune, you became part of her lattice. The echo deepens. The net expands. And Margaret, wherever she is, if that's even her name anymore, grows more defined. She is not coming through the mirror. She is the mirror. And every reflection you see from this day forward might not be yours. In early 2019, a team of archivists from the University of Dunloe undertook a private restoration of a lost journal believed to belong to Ruth Vexley, Margaret's mother. It had been discovered inside a locked trunk, recovered from a crumbled crawlspace beneath the estate's east wing. The journal was water-damaged, its ink bled, and pages warped beyond recognition. But several entries remained legible, and what they revealed wasn't hysteria. It was instruction. Ruth wrote of the girl who does not eat, who does not age, who does not forgive. She detailed a set of rites passed down to her, not through books, but through dreams. Dreams whispered to her by a figure she referred to only as the one in reverse. A presence she claimed could step behind reality and rearrange it. And it wanted something. Not a soul, not a body, but space. Space in memory. Space in fear. Space in your reflection. The journal speaks of an event called the reversal, where she shall emerge not from birth, but from recognition, brought forth by those who do not believe, who mock, who repeat her name in jest. Sound familiar? It should, because that's how viral terror works. It's not belief that powers it. It's participation. You don't have to believe Margaret exists. You just have to look. You just have to speak. And the more you try to debunk her, the more real she becomes. One of Ruth's final entries reads, "The body is gone, but the gaze remains. I have locked all the mirrors, but her eyes still find mine, because she isn't trapped in the glass. She's trapped in me." After this entry, Ruth Vexley was never seen again. Her death was never recorded. Her grave never found. Many believe she succeeded in the final rite, offering not her life, but herself to preserve the child's pattern in time. But some researchers now theorize something darker. That Margaret never died, because Margaret was never alive in the way we understand it. She was encoded, built from repetition, blood, reflection, and fear. And the Vexleys? They weren't a cursed family. They were engineers. Architects of a horror that doesn't fade with time. It spreads through it, just like you're helping it do now. In the winter of 2020, a security firm based in Chicago ran a strange internal test. They installed facial recognition AI across a dozen abandoned government buildings slated for demolition. The goal was to analyze squatter patterns. But within 72 hours, the system flagged an anomaly. A figure appearing in mirrored surfaces across 7 separate buildings at identical timestamps. Always female, always alone, always just outside the visible spectrum, detectable only when the system ran thermal differential sweeps. But the strangest part? Each appearance caused a spike in electromagnetic interference. Not near the mirrors, but inside the servers themselves. It was as if the image wasn't being captured, it was being transmitted. When investigators tried to retrieve the original footage, they found nothing but recursive static, layered in the pattern of human vocal wavelengths. And deep in the audio bed, slowed to 20%, was a child's voice humming a melody that has now appeared in 17 different cases tied to the Vexley name. This was no longer a haunting. It was a code, a structure built from image, sound, and memory. One that doesn't just want to be seen, it wants to seed. Every person who viewed that footage reported the same symptoms. Headaches behind the eyes, sudden temperature drops in mirrors, and one overwhelming urge to check their reflection. Compulsion. That's how it starts. Because the Vexley pattern doesn't just reflect light, it reflects awareness. It wants to know that you know it's real. Not believe. No. And if you do, you're already part of it. See, Margaret Vexley was never meant to escape the mirror. She was designed to duplicate inside the ones who stare too long. A virus of self. A haunting that rewrites you from within. That's why those who study her go quiet. That's why so many disappear. Because she doesn't need to kill you. She just needs to become the version of you that looks back when no one else is watching. And the more you research, the more you investigate, the clearer her face becomes. You may not see it now, but you'll start to. At first in dreams, then in glass, and then, worst of all, in others. That'll be why the spring of 2021, a quiet blackout began across online archives tied to the Vexley lineage. Photos vanished. Birth records were locked. Historical journals went missing from local libraries. One particularly chilling case involved a genealogist from Baltimore who'd been researching noble families of 19th century Massachusetts. Her final forum post, made under an alias, read, "I've traced a thread, not of people, but of faces. She's not aging. She's spreading." When users asked who she was, the account deleted itself. Her name was Amelia Hart. Her body was found inside her apartment 3 weeks later, slumped in front of her bathroom mirror, all glass removed from the walls. Every shard had been collected into a neat pile at her feet, wrapped in silk. The mirror had no cracks. But the reflection? It did. A split, only visible in photographs, showing a faint outline of another face. Not Amelia's. You might think this is an exaggeration, another internet myth. But ask yourself, why are there no verified photographs of Margaret Vexley? Why do all portraits of the Vexley estate appear smudged when scanned or digitized? Why do 3 different AI datasets, trained on historical data, refuse to generate an image of the Vexley child without producing errors? There is only one known attempt to reconstruct her face using composite software. The result? Every user described the same sensation: burning in the eyes, auditory distortion, and, most disturbingly, recognition. One viewer even wrote, "It felt like I was looking at someone I already knew, or someone I was supposed to become." That's the trap. Margaret isn't trying to be remembered. She's trying to be reconstructed. Through us. Through fascination. Through obsession. And every time her story is told, she gets clearer, more defined, more precise, like an echo being sharpened by 1,000 retellings. And that's the most horrifying truth of all. You can't destroy her image, because she isn't in the image. She's in you. So go ahead. Search the mirrors in your house. Stare a little longer than you should. Ask yourself if what's looking back is perfectly in sync. Because the moment it's not, that's when she's found her way through. And all that will remain of you is reflection. We are now entering a phase of the story where facts become warnings, where history crosses into pattern and names into triggers. In October 2022, a closed-door psychological symposium in Oslo presented a case titled The Recurrence of Non-Localized Identity in Post-Traumatic Mirror Trauma. The speaker was Dr. Emil Graven, an expert in visual psychosis and mnemonic hallucination. His findings were pulled from a cluster of patients across 4 countries, none of whom had met, yet all of whom shared the same symptoms. They no longer recognized their reflections. They reported seeing a girl behind their shoulder, but only in peripheral view. And in dreams, they were addressed by a child's voice calling them mother. The patients were of different ages, different backgrounds, but they all shared one piece of online history. Each had interacted with content tied to the Vexley name. Some read articles, others watched videos. A few had only glanced at scanned portraits for research. But the timeline was unmistakable. Contact, then obsession, then distortion. Dr. Graven concluded with a chilling hypothesis that some stories act like parasites, narrative viruses that latch to belief systems and use consciousness as a host. He called it a sympathetic construct, a being that doesn't need to exist in the physical world, only in the shared minds of enough people who feed it shape, story, and emotion. And once the construct takes form, even in thought, it begins to feed back, creating behaviors, sightings, and consequences that mirror its own fiction. Which means, Margaret Vexley does not need to be real. She only needs to be remembered the same way, by enough minds, in enough places, for her to stabilize in the psychic substrate of reality. It's not about haunting. It's not about ghosts. It's about influence, a story so potent it invades how we think, how we see, how we identify ourselves. That's why mirrors matter. Because they are not doors. They are filters. Margaret doesn't come through them. She comes into focus within them. And once she's visible, the only way to erase her is to forget her completely. But you won't. Not after this. Not after everything you've heard. And the more you try not to think about her, the stronger she gets. Let's take a breath. Ask the question most refuse to voice. Why the Vexley family? Why does this single bloodline, buried in the folds of forgotten American history, resonate with such unnatural intensity? Because they are not just a family. They are a design. Margaret was the face, but behind her was the pattern. The Vexleys were deeply embedded in early transatlantic medical societies, secret scientific exchanges, and lesser-known occultic circles operating between Massachusetts, Lisbon, and Bavaria in the mid-1800s. The journals hidden inside the manor's East Wing reference something unholy. The mechanism of reflection as a carrier of conscious will. The theory? That through trauma, obsession, and repeated ritual exposure, human thought could detach, then replicate in mirrored realities. Not metaphorically, literally. And the subject they experimented on was not an object. It was their daughter, Margaret, born to be the vessel, raised without identity outside the mirror. Denied reality except as projection. They didn't want her to become someone. They wanted her to become everyone. To spread like folklore, disguised as curiosity, seeded through retellings, sharpened by fear. And it worked. Because unlike other hauntings, Margaret never needed to touch you. She only needed you to ask. Who was she? That single thought unlocks the corridor. The moment you assign meaning to her image, you give her shape. And when enough minds agree on her shape, she becomes real enough to act. That's the secret the Vexleys died to keep. Why their name has been censored, buried, rewritten. Because they weren't destroyed. They were archived. The Vexley pattern continues not through blood, but through data. Scanned photographs, spoken tales, digitized diaries. You're not dealing with a ghost. You're dealing with a recursive identity virus, a self-reinforcing loop of imagery, emotion, and narrative that gets more precise every time it's told. That's why you feel her in a room when her name is spoken aloud. Why mirrors feel wrong after you've heard her story. Why children report seeing her first. Because they haven't built the cognitive defenses adults cling to. They see what's really there. Not the ghost of a girl, but the will of a pattern. One that was born from cruelty, raised through secrecy, and sustained by every eye that looks into the glass and wonders, am I still alone? This is the last thing I'll say. And if you've made it this far, you need to hear it without distraction. Margaret Vexley was never meant to survive. She was meant to continue. The Vexley family didn't try to preserve her in body. They knew that would rot. They didn't even preserve her in name. That would fade. They preserved her in pattern, in story, in mirror, and in the one thing no one can ever truly destroy: memory. We don't bury memories. We replay them. We whisper them. We share them, thinking we're safe, because they're just words. But when the memory isn't yours, when it's been planted, sculpted, designed to seed itself into the soft parts of the mind, that's not remembering. That's hosting. So look around. The mirror in your hallway. The reflection in your phone. The split-second shimmer in a car window. Every surface that returns your face to you might not be telling the truth anymore. Because reflections were never passive. They were always watching back. And Margaret? She was trained, broken, shaped, refined to live in those reflections. Not haunt them. Live in them. Waiting for the gaze of the right kind of mind. Curious. Obsessive. Wounded. Yours. DeadScroll wasn't created just to tell horror. It exists to warn. To remind you that not all stories end. Some awaken. Some are trapped set in language and retold in low voices at night. Passed like a curse key from one mind to another. And now that key is in your hands. You can close the browser. You can shut off the lights. You can even laugh and tell yourself it was just a video. But when you're alone, when the mirror feels too still, when the shape behind you feels almost familiar, you'll remember Margaret. Not as a ghost, but as a possibility. One you can't unsee. One you'll feel every time the light flickers. So choose carefully what you look at in the dark. And be even more careful about what looks back. This has been DeadScroll. Subscribe before she does. And comment the words, "I saw her too." Let others know you're no longer alone. We are all reflections now. And the glass remembers. Forever.